That's right.
Righty. Mr. Sunak, can we pick up, as I said we would, the position in the autumn of 2020 with the decision to extend the job retention scheme and not to implement the job support scheme open and closed? We understand that the furlough scheme, job retention scheme, was due to end on the 31st of October 2020, to give some context, and was then going to be replaced by the job support scheme as part of the winding down of furlough, essentially. That was the economic planning, if you like, working up the job support scheme whilst looking to end the job retention scheme. But in terms of the health picture, I think, as your statement acknowledges, in that autumn, so early September onwards, there were various contingencies being worked up in Whitehall in terms of the health position. Is that right? One of which was the potential towards a further national lockdown if infection rates continue to increase.
Yes, I think that's a fair summary. We went into the design process for JSS on the basis of the initial roadmap exit plan that had been developed, and then I think the tiering system that was put in place. So JSS was very much designed for that world. I think, as I alluded in the statement, we always knew that there was uncertainty around the potential spread and path of the virus. So I'm sure during that period, and there were discussions we had, knowing that might be an option that would have to be brought back if it went a particular way. So that was always there, and then ultimately, as the health situation deteriorated and the tiering system went, and we went back to a national lockdown, it obviously made more sense just to bring CJRS back.
Yes, thank you. Or we'll not bring it back, but just
to extend it. I was just going to correct myself as well. Extend it and not introduce JSS as planned.
Because I think the direction to HMRC to extend came on the day it was due to end, which was the 31st of October.
Yeah, that's which I think, because that was also from memory. I'm just trying to check. I mean, I think it was that also the day that it was decided we would change the health restrictions and enter another lockdown from memory around. Is that it was the things were linked?
Yes,
in that sense.
Yes, that's right. The two things were coming together. But in terms of timing, I mean, it's obviously not ideal from a business planning perspective to think one thing may happen and then be told another was going to happen at short notice. That's a slightly different issue, which I'll come back to whether operationally there were any risks in leaving the decision that late, or was the position that because CGRS was up and running and you knew it worked and was deliverable, that there wasn't a great operational risk in switching to CGRS rather than bringing in JSS?
I don't think there was any operational risk from memory at all, because as you rightly said, anyway, it was already in operation and people were used to it, and so that bit was fine. If anything, there would have been operational risk about whatever when you do something new. So in that sense, I have no memory that was an issue at all. Obviously, it was far from ideal that the situation had deteriorated so quickly, and that meant that we had to change what we were doing. But that was very much in response to the deteriorating health situation, which was obviously not something that we were in control over. And it was, I still think, right to, for all the reasons we discussed earlier, right to have tried to develop something that could be more targeted. And I still said, I think that was the right thing to have done and to spend time on. And if we hadn't ended up in that health scenario, would have introduced. And I'm sure it would not have been perfect either, but I think that was a worthwhile thing to have pursued. But as the health situation then deteriorated very quickly, it made sense to stick with CGRS, and that was it, really. There's not much more I can probably add to that.
No, and so from the Treasury's perspective, the health situation is determining the economic response.
Yes.
We've already covered that ground, but does this also go back to the other responsibility you had as Chancellor, which is not to spend money where you don't need to spend it? It's all about withdrawing or reducing support when that's appropriate as well.
Yeah, of course. And that it goes right back to the beginning and, all those different economic objectives we have. Of course, value for money, minimising fiscal cost and allowing that effective recovery of the economy so that resources are allocated efficiently, to use a slightly more wonky phrase. That is also an important set of considerations, and it makes sense to weight those considerations, especially as you're out of the worst of the health situation and then can start to iterate policy in that direction. And that's what the plan was. And then obviously the health situation deteriorated, and therefore we had to adjust on the economic support side. But as I said, I don't think it was wrong to have planned for JSS and to have done the work on it and be prepared to implement it had the health situation carried on as originally expected. That was also the right thing to do, and if this happened again in the future, I think someone should look to do that as well at the appropriate time.
Now, I accept that this next question I want to put to you is that might be characterised as you could be criticised for ending something too soon. You could be criticised for something going on too long. This is the perfection of judgment about timing. But when you look back over CJRS, it was stood up again or continued 31st October 2020 and then eventually ended. Do you think that some over-reliance crept in on to furlough, that it could have been withdrawn sooner? Or how are you making that decision?
I think this is something where we have to be really careful about hindsight. And I think, again, with the greatest respect, obviously, to Milady and yourself, Mr. Wright, I think the right question to ask is, at that moment in time, was it a reasonable judgment to make? And I believe that it was. Everyone was worried, anxious about what would happen to unemployment when furlough ended. There were perfectly credible voices who wanted it to go on for longer than it did, including obviously the TUC. I think at least one, if not two or three, of the devolved administration's finance ministers and leaders. I think at the then opposition, now government, members of and beyond. So there clearly was a debate to be had about it. I thought our approach was about right in that what we did do, and I think Tim alluded to this in his evidence as well, is that because of the tapering and the necessity for employer contributions in those back end few months, you saw, I don't have the figures to hand, but you did see, as we expected, a pretty strong decline month on month over the last few months. And what we're really talking about when someone asks this question is it's probably a matter of 2 months, because the restrictions really only ended fully in July, at the end of July, and this went on for 2 more months. So I think we're talking about 2 months where the fiscal cost, I think if you look at it, and I'm sorry I don't have the figures to hand, but the fiscal cost for those last 2 months was probably very small because the numbers were low and the employer contributions were higher. So, was it a reasonable judgment to do what we did? I think it was. I think there's nothing that you can, and hindsight, as we said, sure, when it ended, there was not a big spike in unemployment that people feared, and it was fine. So maybe that argues for being able to have done something sooner. I don't. If this thing happens again, it's not obvious to me that there's some learning from that period that would make it easier for someone in my position to make that balance any better than they will have at the time to weigh up these various things, right? There'll be a public debate, there'll be people saying both things, they'll be looking at all the different bits of data, as I was, about the decline in people on furlough, the resumption of economic activity, it's all these things, taking all these inputs and just having to make a judgment. And as I said, because of the employer contributions, the cost was lower, and that was a good thing. And I think, in the round, we're talking about 2 months. It's not obvious to me that there's a specific learning, as I said, that would help someone next time around fine-tune it by a month better. But again, reasonable people can disagree.
I mean, the fact there wasn't a big spike in unemployment, I mean, turning it on its head might be seen as a good thing. In other words, if this was meant to preserve jobs,
Yes.
then the fact lots of people haven't been made unemployed when it ends might suggest a positive.
No, but I think the point that some people would make is because there wasn't, therefore you may have been able to do it earlier. That is the logic. As I said, it's not logic that I necessarily disagree with, but I think there's no way to test the counterfactual. And my point is, I don't think anyone would really say it should have ended whilst there were still restrictions, and they only finished at the end of July. So I think what we're talking about here is a matter of 2 months. And I said, could it have ended 2 months? We'll never quite know what would have happened if we did end it at the end of July. I think in the scheme of things, it was kind of reasonable judgment to make.
I certainly don't want to apply any sort of perfect hindsight to these sort of judgments, Mr. Sunak, and I didn't mean to imply.
No, and I wasn't implying that you were, but I think it's just
But just to take that a bit further, I suppose one of the questions might be: is it possible to, in a future emergency, or would it have been possible in this emergency, to devise criteria that were published, known, that when these things happen, it will end? Because that would be another way of looking at the end of something, to say, well, when these factors are all aligned, then we will bring it to an end.
I can certainly appreciate the appeal of something like that, the kind of mechanical thing. Having sat in the chair and had to make the decision, I'm not sure it can be reduced to, here are 3 formulas, and if X is 5 and A equals 2, then yes, it goes on, and if they're less than that, it stays. It's a subjective judgment based on a range of different variables, which I'm not entirely sure could be reduced to a mechanical formula. Is my sense of it. We did have a version of that. Obviously, the Prime Minister put those tests in place for thinking about exit from roadmap. But again, they were part quantitative, part qualitative assessments. So it's not as if from the outside someone could have perfect certainty about what it would mean. They could have reasonable understanding, but they were not mechanical formulas even there. So again, we're down to talking about a couple of months. Could we have... could there have been some set of things we talked about? We would have ended it a month or 2 earlier. I don't know. And I think things, again, you're monitoring this data, Mr. Wright, day by day as things were reopening. There were 4 or 5 week gaps between each thing. So something had to open, or we released some restrictions. Then you needed to see how the economy reacted. Were businesses reopening? Were they bringing people back? How were people going out and doing those activities again and spending money? You had to watch that happen in real time. So I'm not entirely sure if you could have done it far in advance anyway, is the other thing, because this stuff was changing in front of your eyes by the day.
Just turning that proposition of criteria on its head and looking at it the other way, from a sort of business certainty and public confidence perspective, what about in a future emergency saying, well, while certain things are happening, it will not be withdrawn? So turning it on its head. So in other words, whilst we're still locked down, it won't be withdrawn. Or whilst we are under a certain level of restriction. Or again, do you think all the same problems apply?
I'm trying to think. Effectively, that's what was the case, because we had run it to the end of September. The roadmap, I said, released the restrictions at the end of July. The employer contributions and things started coming in July as well. So that was all telegraphed, I think, in the spring, so people had lots of time to plan. And I'm sure I said, I can't quite remember, kind of the implicit understanding, I'm sure, was, well, and if things change, we'll reevaluate, because we've done that. At that point, we'd done that two or 3 times already. So yeah. I think that was a kind of given. If things got materially worse, then we would obviously relook at the situation. But I think my sense is at the time then we'd given people a good amount of time to plan, and we could handle a little bit of flex if if the roadmap slipped to the right, which it did do by, I think one step was delayed by 4 weeks from memory. So I think that turned out to be sensible, that we had erred a little bit on the side of caution, because actually we needed some of that buffer, and for it still to then be tapering off as the economy was fully open. So that was sensible. But again, you could argue if that hadn't happened, it would have looked a little bit of a worse decision, because it would have maybe then been a month more than one was needed. So I think my broad thing is, I think we're talking about a matter of weeks, at most 2 months, really. And for me, it's hard to reduce it to something so formulaic. So giving people some certainty, probably erring a little bit on the generous side to deal with any bumps in the road, having the employer contributions come in, so you've got that tapering and self-selection at the same time. That seems to me to strike a reasonable balance, which is what we did. But again, I think it's hard without hindsight to really know if you could have had a high conviction different view. Not least, as I said, because lots of very credible people, and it's easy to say now and after it ended. At the time, and I remember being in Parliament and all the interviews I did, I was getting a lot of pushback on the idea this was ending, right? And all the questions I was getting were the opposite. And as I said, from members of the then opposition and more generally, it was very much, this is too premature and you're just wanting to withdraw support and you're focused on balancing the books again, and here we go.
Understood. Can I just pick up just one more point on this, though, developing on that point? So those who say, it should have carried on for longer, it could have carried on for much longer. From an economic perspective, so I'm not talking about the fiscal cost of the intervention, but in terms of a longer term cost or damage to the economy, are there reasons not to have a furlough scheme going on too long that are important?
Yes, absolutely. And I don't think there would be an enormous amount of disagreement amongst that. At least I hope not, because markets allocate resources efficiently for the most part, and that is individual private businesses, people making those decisions. And what when government starts intervening, trying to preserve things in stasis, that is fine for temporary shocks that are specific. But as that becomes more permanent, and it's not just furlough schemes, there's all sorts of other things that governments can do. What you are doing is interfering with the normal mechanism of the market, and in general, you're potentially preserving businesses and jobs which in the long run aren't actually viable or sustainable. And that's never a good long-term thing for the economy. You're inhibiting its productive growth. And what government should be doing is allowing that process to happen, then obviously providing the support for people with training, skills, making sure new businesses can be created easily. Because what you want in a dynamic economy, if you want a fast-growing economy, is you need that. You need that process to happen. You need those businesses which, sadly are not sustainable or viable, to fail. You need new businesses to take their place. Investment needs to go to where it has a highest return. People need to be in jobs which actually are sustainable and can pay them a good wage, not ones that are being propped up artificially by taxpayers. So absolutely, in the long term, that is not a sensible feature of any market-oriented economy.
And so your decisions about ending these sorts of supports were not simply what's the fiscal cost per month of this continuing, but also is there reaching a point where carrying on may do more harm to the economy than stopping?
Yes, and it goes, again, all the way back to that conversation we had at the beginning. If you just remember, I set out those 4 or 5 economic objectives. This was one of them. It was about, when the time is right, allowing normal economic activity to resume, and that normal market economy to function, because in the long run, that's the best way to raise people's living standards and grow an economy.
Okay, thank you. Well, those are my questions about the job retention scheme. I'm going to move on to the self-employed income support scheme now. I think we've covered most of CJRS. I hope we have. Is there anything before I move on that you wish to add about the scheme? Any point of learning about the scheme, or have we covered that in the question?
I think we've had a good, comprehensive discussion on it. I think we've covered the reflections as we went through. So, okay. If anything occurs to me, I'll
there'll be an opportunity
tomorrow. Yes, but I think that we've covered everything that I've thought through. So.
So self-employed income support scheme, and again, I'll just give some high-level statistics from the evaluation that was conducted into that scheme, just to put this into context. So this was an income replacement scheme for self-employed people. The total benefits created by the scheme were estimated to be £19.3 billion, with an accompanying social cost of £5.1 billion. Payments were made quickly post-launch. There was an application date of 13th of May. By the 25th of May 2020, so 12 days later, 88% of claims have been paid out, and 99.4% of self-employed income support scheme claims were paid within the government's own target of 6 working days from the application. So that's just to give some sense of the scale and the assessment of how the scheme landed. I'll ask the question in the way that sorry to keep coming back to Dr. Loynig. He's obviously made an impression, but I'll ask the question really founded in the way he put it, and so we can have your response to this. That there was an extent he felt that this scheme was really a trade-off between an economic case for support and a moral political case for support, because this was a very vocal political group lobbying for support, whereas morally, perhaps, I don't know if morally is the right word, but that's how he put it, not as deserving as the job supports provided through CJRS. But what was your rationale for the scheme, and why do you say it was necessary and important, Mr. Sunak?
I think taking a step back, it was at its most simple level, the government stopping people from working and doing what they wanted to do, and therefore having some responsibility to support them through that period. And that applies equally to those who are self-employed as it does to those in work. And of course, we've spoken through the economic theory of scarring and labour matches, and that's all true. But actually, put the economic bit aside, there's just a slightly more fundamental thing that everyone was going about their day-to-day life, trying to work hard, provide for their families, build a better life. Government comes in and says, no, sorry, we're not going to let you do that anymore. And I just didn't think it would be right to then not have something to say to those people to support them through it. And that really is what the self-employment support scheme was about. And it broadly, not perfectly, but broadly was designed to give comparable support to those who are self-employed as those who are in employment. I think Tim, in his evidence, also said that he thought it was perfectly reasonable to him as an economist that the self-employed and employed should, in some loose sense, have the same level of support, and this is the kind of closest that we could do, and that was what he said, and I think that's right in a nutshell, and we can get into the design of it, but that was the kind of thesis behind doing it from my perspective.
Can I interrupt? Sorry.
Of course, Molly.
Doesn't the economic scarring argument apply to the self-employed too? Because an awful lot of self-employed people, I confess I have an interest here, having been self-employed for a long time, but don't a lot of put me to one side. Don't a lot of self-employed people contribute to the economy? Don't you have the economic scarring argument that can apply to a lot of self-employed businesses?
Not to make Tim, I think if Tim was here, he might say the difference, milady, and I'm going to try and make his argument for him, not mine, but I think he would say that the difference is that nothing stops you as a self-employed individual doing what you want to do thereafter, whereas if you're employed and you lose your job, you can't automatically just go back to doing what you were doing before. That, I think, is not to put words in his mouth, but he might have said something to that effect when he was here. That's why he might say that they are different. I tend to broadly sympathise with your perspective on it. At the end of the day, these are people who we wanted to make sure that they were still able to be economically productive and active when possible, and therefore providing some support to them would make that more likely. I think the TUC provided some good evidence on this point, and I think Kate was quite good on this particular point. That I think she gave the example of a self-employed salon or hairstylist or beautician who would have had a bunch of things, may have even had paid rent in somewhere, and if they had not been supported, all of that would have gone. Would have had to have sell all of that, broken all those relationships with wherever she was, those client relationships, etc., and therefore would not as easily be able to bounce back. And it's effectively like having been let go in a company. So I think Kate would give you the example of something that very much is in line with what you said, and that was my general sense. Now, I think Tim would say that's perfectly fair. It probably doesn't apply to everyone in quite the same way as it did with people in jobs. But I hope I've given you as fair as I can.
You're very good at playing devil's advocate.
No, well, I try and be fair. Obviously, I introduced the scheme and believe in it, so of course, I think that it was the right thing to do, and I would do it again if it was me. And quite candidly, I'm highly confident if this ever happens again, whoever is in my shoes will do something very similar as well. But I'm just at least trying for the sake of you having the full set of arguments. But I thought Kate's evidence on this was quite compelling as bringing it to life how someone who is self-employed actually would have the same scarring type of impact that you would have from someone who is employed.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And as with the job retention scheme, what was speed of delivery and simplicity an important feature of the scheme?
Yes, as simplicity, especially, and I think we haven't touched on it, but just actually your last question of the last session. There's an enormous amount of operational pressure that's put on HMRC at this moment in time, and then we'll come on to universal credit this afternoon and with DWP systems. And I think it's easy to kind of abstract that away, particularly for people who are not used to having to deliver things on the front line. And the scale of these things is enormous. You have to remember that 10 million people were furloughed. Right? 1 million businesses were interacting with the HMRC CGRS system, and then 10 million people were getting the rebates through. On SAYS, 3 million people, right? Again, so there's not just a kind of simplicity for speed, a simplicity for communications and reassurance, which we touched on. There's also a simplicity because what you don't want is for the organisation to be overwhelmed, for the systems to be break down. They only have the capacity to do so much. And actually, even in peacetime, that is the case. As Chancellor afterwards, when you're sitting down with HMRC and you're figuring out here are the various upgrades we can make to the tax system, if we invest here, what systems can we do? It's not as if you can do everything at once. And I had those conversations with them on making tax digital. There's well, you want us to design this over here, you want us to do that over there, and this there. Well, thanks, Chancellor. Actually, we can't do all of that at once. Please tell us which order you want to do it in. And that's not unfair. And obviously, at this period, that was also the reflection. And they would constantly rightly say, look, we can handle this. If you want us to do this, this, and this, it's going to take you that much longer, or we just simply are going to get overwhelmed and then things won't work properly. So that aspect of it, I think, is worth highlighting.
Yeah, you could have promised all sorts of support, but if it was utterly undeliverable, then it wouldn't have been support at all. It would have just been an empty promise. Exactly, and then that obviously damages confidence and reassurance and all the rest of it. So and again, you have to trust. I mean, of course, you probably heard this from other people giving evidence. I always was on the pushy end and demanding end, whether it's with my officials in the Treasury or with HMRC. What's the quickest timeline? Why can't you do more? Why can't we do it faster? But ultimately, you don't want the things to fall over. I think that would be a disaster. So, and if you look at simplicity as between CJRS and SAYS. In CJRS, this was administered through the PAYE system, which gave you a monthly snapshot of employment, real-time information. So that's pretty good data, and it's regular. But under the self-employed income support scheme, you were looking at income tax self-assessment, and there's a time lag, isn't there, in terms of filing? And so did that present an immediate challenge in terms of deliverability?
Yeah, well, it presented, well, in one sense, it made things very easy because there was no other way that you could do this other than relying on the ITSA system, the income tax self-assessment system. It was the only database that we had in government at HMRC that told us who was self-employed, how much had they earned, right? So that there was no alternative. So in that sense, that was clarifying and made things simple. But then that meant that came with a set of constraints. Notably, the data, as you alluded to, Mr. Wright, is quite out of date. And that's a feature of our self-employment assessment system where you filed your tax return the following January after the tax year ends. And so lots of people who were newly self-employed in the most immediate preceding tax year to the onset of the pandemic had not yet filed a tax return, and we had no way of knowing who they were, how much they earned, and it was therefore not possible to bring them into the system at the outset without taking on what I considered to be unacceptable, risk on fraud. And then as soon as we passed the deadline for that, we were able to bring them in. But that's why the ITSA system was used. And as I said, in one sense, it was very good because it was an accurate database of people and their incomes. The flip side was it was the data in it was out of date, and I'm sure we can talk about what that would look like in the future.
Well, can we pick up about the data point now, and then we'll come on to the point you've just made about appetite for risk and fraud. In terms of the future and data, and you've mentioned this already, making tax digital, and you said that this is something HMRC was working on, and it's now working much further through the system. Can you just explain what it is and how it will change potentially these sorts of judgments for a Chancellor in the future?
Yes, I think we are, and I have to confess I'm not sure where the new government is with the roadmap, but before I left the Treasury, we put in place, together with the ministerial team, a new roadmap for making tax digital, partly so that in the future this type of situation would not happen. And what that means is HMRC will be able to collect more income data, same data more regularly.
Quarterly returns, is that
quarterly
right?
returns, exactly.
Yeah.
And I say, forgive me for not remembering the precise details of who that applies to when, but the broad principle is the system will be much more up to date with what's happening in people's lives than it was when I was doing this, and that will make this easier. Fair to say, before the pandemic, when things like that had been mooted, I don't think everyone was jumping up and down and being super excited about doing that, because people would prefer to have the time and do it later, and all the impact it might have on people's cash flow and taxes. But the pandemic showed why it would be beneficial, at least from this perspective, to have that quarterly tax information from making tax digital. Yeah. So.
Okay, you didn't have the luxury of that. You had income tax self-assessment, and you've explained why, therefore, the newly self-employed weren't eligible in the early cohorts of this support. Can I just pick up, you referenced the risk of fraud. Now, presumably that's because if you wanted to include the recently self-employed, you'd have to effectively self-certify or have some method of self-certifying that they were in fact self-employed, they did in fact have income, and they were in fact eligible.
The whole thing would be completely just as you described.
Yeah. So that's the first point. Is there not also, and we picked this up with Sir James Hara in his evidence, there was also and this touches on something you said earlier about the pressure HMRC was under. Not only would there have to be self-certification, but there'd have to be a manual process of checking and accreditation, which goes hand in hand with that.
And that goes to the point I was talking about earlier, that just the operational demands on HMRC. Any time that HMRC have to start doing any degree of manual verification of anything or spot checking of any kind of scale, clearly the resource implications are significant, which is why when ITSA is great because it can all be done largely digitally, and that means that there isn't a huge human human component to that bit. So that Jim's absolutely right to make that point. And you see that in other areas. Now, you make some exceptions for some very small groups of people with a particular case, and I think women on maternity leave and things like that on CJRS, we made some very specific manual flexibilities because we felt that group of people really should not be disadvantaged in any way, and it was a small enough group of people that we could manage a manual workaround. But to Jim's point on this, that would have been a huge undertaking.
Now we know that. In the devolved administrations, support schemes were stood up to support the newly self-employed who weren't eligible for the UK-wide self-employed income support scheme. For example, the newly self-employed hardship fund in Scotland. And I asked Kate Forbes about this when she gave evidence, and I put it to her, was it really a question of the Scottish government had a greater appetite for risk than the UK government? It was willing to take the risk of self-certification. But did you consider exploring that and engaging with the devolved administration to see if there's any learning there, or had you made a decision that the risks and the processing obstacles were too great?
I can't recall specifically on that discrete intervention, but more generally on SAYS, because it had to be designed in a way with various different criteria, all of which were necessarily imperfect. There was a continual debate, discussion, re-look at policy to see what could be tweaked, if things could be changed, not least because there was a huge amount of incoming into the Treasury about all these issues. So it absolutely was not the case that it stood up, announced it, off you go, done. I think the entire time that this scheme was in place, in terms of incoming to please can you change this, please can you change that, what about this, was probably the scheme where we had the most of that, actually. And that goes to our earlier question on targeting on CJRS. Here, this was targeted. It was imperfectly targeted because that's all you could do. And then you spend a huge amount of time with all the people who are not captured and feel that they should be, and then trying to figure out if you can tweak the design. And so that's kind of interesting observation on that. But I can't remember on that specific one, but as a general point, I would say that there was constant looking at all aspects of this to see if there are things that could be tweaked, changed, iterated as we went through, because by its design it was certainly more imperfect than CGRS was.
Yeah. So if you think about the heat that you got externally from the imperfect targeting of this scheme, amplify that 100-fold and think about how CJRS would have gone if you'd have tried to target.
I think that is a fair reflection or takeaway. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Can we just run through a couple of other, if you like, hard edges in the scheme? And this goes to this targeting point you've made. The 50% self-employed income test. So this was, you had to have at least 50% of your income from self-employment to be eligible under the scheme, and there was no tapering. It was effectively a cliff edge. Can you just help us with the rationale for that?
Yes.
And whether you considered a taper and why it was not workable?
I think it's interesting in how you introduced the question, Mr. Wright. You talk about the hard edges. And I think that's exactly it. See, one person's targeting is another person's hard edge, right? And those are two sides of the same coin. So, an abstract discussion about targeting is all good and well from an economic theory perspective. And then here is an example where we're going to go through now the various things we did to try and target it. And we end up having the conversation about the hard edges completely reasonably. But I think it just illustrates the challenge with this, because there is no perfect targeting. And anyone who comes here and says, well, with this bit of data, it would have been perfect, I think is probably not being, I think, realistic about this in the future. So that you have to accept, well, I'm not avoiding your question, we'll get into it, that you have to accept in all these things, there's always just going to be a trade-off. And I think I'd say reasonable people can disagree on those trade-offs, but targeting is beneficial for objective 4 and 5, but it's less good for 1, 2, and 3, and some people are going to feel aggrieved. So that is the nature of it. But on the 50% criteria, and again, this was something that was suggested by officials, which I agreed with. The idea here was, look, remember, all we are doing here is people are going to opt in, and that's an important thing, actually, which we should come to. But people are going to opt into saying that they need this. So that is really our only kind of check. It's not the same as an employer who's putting someone on furlough. We don't know about this person's circumstances, really. Are they affected by the pandemic? Are they the person who's a stylist, or we've closed down that industry effectively, we've prohibited close contact, or are they someone who's happily carrying on working? We don't know. So it is right to try and target where we can to minimise the fiscal impact and sharpen it a bit on those who really need help. The 50% criteria was designed to say, look, there's lots of people who have some self-employment income, but what this scheme is really there for is to help the people whose life largely is dependent on self-employed income, who are self-employed. The self-employment activity that they carry out, is really the main way that they and their family have financial security. So, in that vein, saying that your self-employment income had to be, and I think the advice recommended 2 options, either greater than 50%, or you could have been a bit stricter and said greater than 2/3 of your overall income. It doesn't seem an unreasonable approach to take. That's what this criteria. That's what this criteria did, and I think that from memory, the median kind of self-employment income from those people who were not eligible because of this criteria was, I think, something like £4,000 or £5,000, right? So it was not their primary source of overall income, and we could target help on those for whom it was. That was the thesis behind this particular threshold. And again, you could, the advice had an option of 2/3, which would have been stricter. We went with 50%, which was a little bit more broad and generous.
And in terms of 50%, 2/3, no magic in the number.
No.
You just had to.
No.
You had to arrive at a number.
Had to arrive at a number, and I think reasonably people could have done 2/3. 50% is like, at least the majority of your income is coming from self-employment. Seems a kind of minimum bar to cross to be calling yourself self-employed or to have a scheme that's supporting you. So that seemed probably the generous interpretation relative to 66% or 2/3.
Now, I appreciate this next question may sound like, well, you could say you could pick anybody who's a loser and put a scenario, but I just want to pick this up, thinking about the most vulnerable, economically vulnerable. For those who say had a low-paid job and a small pot of self-employed income on top of that self-employed income might be what made the difference between the wage that they earned in their job and being able to provide for their family.
Yeah.
What they would fall in the gap in the scheme, but what would your reaction to that be in terms of how you can design out of that, how anyone can design out of
Well, I mean, they can't. So you will, I'm 100% sure, with everything that we did, as big and as comprehensive as it was, and we talked about the scale, you will always be able to find individual people who, for whatever reason, don't quite meet the exact criteria because of their particular circumstances. It would be wrong to pretend otherwise. Of course, that was the case. So what you can then do is make sure you've got lots of different types of support, so that even if someone doesn't get something over here, they will get picked up over here. And that's why we'll come on to universal credit later this afternoon. Probably the person that you're describing would be eligible for universal credit and would have benefited from the changes we made there. Similarly, we also provided the hardship fund to local authorities, which was the most discretionary of pots, which was effectively a way of saying that for people who, for whatever reason, just need some extra help, who we have not been able to find through all these dozens of things that we've set up, they can talk to their local authority at a very local level, and those people know those families, and get that extra assistance from them. And so that was and then we topped that up a couple of different times through the pandemic, so there was always funding there. And I could go on, but straight away, those are two other things that probably would have helped the person that you're describing.
So I think your principal point is, whilst I am in my questioning focusing on one scheme at a time and looking at that scheme in isolation and identifying gaps in it, you would say this is one of many schemes that government was introducing, and you have to look at the panoply of support in different ways that was available, not just look at a hard edge in scheme A rather than...
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Having said that, can we just pick up one other hard edge, if you like, which is the other untapered hard edge of the £50,000 income criteria. So earn 50,000 and a pound, no support, earn £49,999 support. And in particular, I'm just interested in the consideration given to a taper, because there'd been a taper in the high-earning child benefit
charge.
And if you did consider it, why you didn't, and the rationale, please.
Yeah. So I think first, again, we're trying to target this thing on those who most need it, and 50k just being as it was then, the threshold for higher rate tax. So what first thing is this did not mean that many people as a percentage were ineligible. I think the number was 4 or 5%. So as a result of this, I'll get onto the taper question in a minute. So as a result of this bit of targeting, focusing the scheme on those who earn less than 50k, it meant that around 5% of people were ineligible. So it was not, in the scheme of things, a huge number. And the average income of those people was, I think, £200,000. Just again, now that's me sitting in the Treasury looking at the macro statistics. You absolutely could find someone who £50,001. I'm confident of that. But in aggregate, we're talking about 4 to 5% of people, average income of about £200,000. So that's the backdrop. So why? And so given that, why? Also then why not a taper? Look, tapers are complex. I mean, anyone who's trying to sit there and with that Hickbick taper will tell you that. And in this particular instance, there were two reasons we didn't do it. One is, as you heard from Jim Harrow, the Perm Sec at HMRC, it would have delayed implementation significantly by a matter of several weeks, I think, from memory, but he's been clear about that. So a taper would have delayed implementation because of the complexity of it. And generally you do tapers because there's a behavioural impact of them, and you're trying to not have economic behaviour be distorted by a cliff edge, and that's the rationale for doing tapers generally. In this instance, these were in theory one-off payments based on an income that you had earned in the past, so there was less argument that this was going to have a behavioural impact and therefore was worth the extra time delay and hassle of putting in a taper, especially given the as a percentage smaller number of people who were actually impacted by it in any case.
So a potential claimant couldn't think, well, I'll delay putting in that invoice because I don't want to go over the amount, because we're talking about a year past.
It was a backwards-looking, at this point it was a backwards-looking thing. You couldn't do anything about it anyway. So
no, all right. Just want to pick up, I suppose, looking at this the other way, the other argument, there are elements that were too generous in the sense that, and this is a point that Dr. Brewer picked up in his report, that you could say that the lack of conditionality, it being a condition that you have lost income to a significant extent, meant that some self-employed people who didn't really need the support were being given it, and that got tightened up over time, didn't it, in terms of the certification?
And again, I didn't see one. I'm not sure that I've seen a way that you could have done that during this. We had the long conversation on targeting and CGRS, which I won't repeat. But there really was no way to do that during. What we did do and could do, because I don't disagree with the premise at all. Of course, I'd rather really focus this on people who most need it. Of course, I would prefer to do that. When we could, we did. And you saw, but that really took until 2021, because by then you'd had, a kind of year of the pandemic. And what you were able to do then for the last two grants, I think it was, in the summer and autumn of 2021, you were able to say, well, we had a pandemic last year, spring 20 to spring 21. So now we're going to separate these grants out, and it's going to be a function of how much your revenue declined, your income declined or trading profits declined in the last year. So as soon as we could inject some degree of targeting, we did, and I think that was sensible. So we had two levels of grant depending on your turnover, income, or income decline. Again, reasonable people would disagree potentially on where you set those thresholds, but principle, I agree with. When we could do it, we did do it, but I don't know how you could have done that during the previous year very easily. The only thing I have heard, and I think this is probably something for people to think about in the future, is I think actually maybe Dr. Brewer mentioned this, was whether one might want to consider a clawback if turnover didn't ultimately fall down. So in that 2021 year, you could say we're going to give these SAYS grants. If it turns out next year when you file your tax return that you're fine, then we'll have that grant back.
Claw it back through self-assessment.
You can claw it back through self-assessment. Now, I think you need some extra legal powers to do that from memory, because I think we looked at it the following year. I think you need primary legislation from memory, but you need. I think that would require legislation. There's obviously an operational complexity to that the next year, which HMRC would be best placed to answer as to how feasible that is, and it would obviously have a behavioural impact on the margin, because people would then be figuring out, well, I might not bother working because I'd rather have the grant. And again, someone would have to model that out. It's not a crazy idea, and I think someone would want to work through all of that to see if it was feasible or practical. But absent that, I haven't seen a way that you could do the targeting in real time in that first year of the pandemic.
But in terms of having a suite of policy options available, if it was deliverable and there was the legislative power to do it, something worth exploring and at least having on the table.
Not an unreasonable thing to explore. I think the other thing that we did do, and which I thought was probably underappreciated, was kind of a good amount of behavioural economics in the application forms for SAYS. There was a kind of affirmation that which had no real legal force, but you had to kind of tick something that says, I have been impacted by the pandemic, and my business has been impacted by the pandemic, and therefore would like to claim this grant, or some variation of that language, and then it got tightened up over time into something called a reasonable belief test, or I have a reasonable belief that I have, etc. And I said I don't think it had legal force. But it had quite a good behavioural force to just, on the margin, hopefully make people think, should I really be claiming this? And actually, interestingly, I was just checking the numbers before today, given that anyone could have got this thing, right? There was no real way, there was no reason they shouldn't get it, even if they were working, in reality. The first grant had an application rate of take-up rate of 77%. So even in that first grant, with very little of this, a quarter of the people self-selected in not claiming it when they could have, then that went down to 69%, 65%, 58%, and by the last grant it was 38%. So just kind of interestingly, even when people were able to claim, that was good affirmation of human behaviour. It's quite good actually. That nudge, I'm sure, making people tick that box, would have contributed to people actually not taking it if they didn't really need it, which is a good thing. And those numbers tell a story of an improving economy through the pandemic as well, and people adjusting. But I think the nudge is worth worth bearing. I would certainly recommend that in general.
But those figures may be an argument against conditionality in the sense that, again, if you assume that general economics people want to go out and earn money and make profit, then when they can, they will.
Yeah. The flip side here is that they could do that and still get the grant, and that is the great challenge of this. You see, that is different to CJRS and the employer discussion, and that is the challenge with this scheme, is that you could do that and still claim the grant. But that's why we had the nudge that you had to tick. Which in theory should help with that, and then later on, and we had the other criteria, and then obviously when we had the revenue information, I think we called it a financial impact test, fit test or FID or something like that, which we introduced.
I know this is fairly granular, but I just want to pick it up briefly on the sort of the fraud front. We understand there was an issue about being able to check across between SAYS and universal credit to see if people were claiming both, and that was really a data issue.
Yes, I saw that in the evidence that you supplied to me last week. I must say, it's not something that I recall.
Well, I won't take it any further.
During the pandemic itself, and look, clearly, if there's a way to do some checking that would, I couldn't quite tell who wanted the data. It felt like DWP wanted the data from HMRC rather than the other way around, but it's not something that I remember being ever raised with me.
Yeah, all right. One other particular group I just want to pick up on, just for your reflections really, but this is company owner managers, so those who essentially own companies and choose to pay themselves through dividends rather than drawing a salary, so they're receiving their income in a different way. I mean, really, did the decision not to do something for that group come down to, well, if they chose to manage their tax affairs in that way, that was a matter for them, or what's your rationale?
No, that it was not that. We actually, much like JSS, and as I was saying about this scheme, this was something that we kept coming back to look at different ways, and the team probably got tired of me going over this again, and every time they thought I'd, just said fine, I'd come back to it a month later because someone had said something to me, or I'd thought of some new idea, or someone had pitched some new idea to me about how we might fix this issue. No, so it was not a desire not to. I mean, we spent a lot of time, and I think that HMT evidence will show that we spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure out if there was a solution here. I mean, look, in a nutshell, the ITSA system, the tax system, can't distinguish between dividends that people receive as a return on capital and dividends that people are receiving effectively as a form of labour income, right? We have no way of knowing, looking at the HMRC system, what those, the dividend is dividend. Could be dividend from someone who's doing absolutely no work as a nice equity portfolio and is clipping a dividend, and great, and it over here it's someone who's a company owner manager, and that is effectively their income every year, and we have no way to differentiate between those two things, and that is the challenge. And we looked at all sorts of ways of trying to do it. There's a closed company director tick box on forms. We went through that, but not everyone ticks it, and not the right people that do tick it even do necessarily fill it in properly. The timing of dividends is obviously very much in the gift of the director, so it's not as predictable. We looked at whether you could use accountants, but they still don't eliminate the need effectively for self-certification, with obviously all the fraud that comes with that. And there really was no one actually knew how many people this was. So what we did know is that about 3.3 million people file tax returns that have dividend income in there. But I think broadly, most people thought the number of company owner managers in the classic sense of it probably was around about 700,000. And that's where you can start to see the issue. So if you just took all the dividend income and said, well, do a version of SAYS for dividend income, I think 3 out of every 4 grants that you would have handed out would have gone to people who actually dividends were just a return on their savings, not not their labour income, and that is a very, very tricky thing to resolve. I think your expert, Dr. Brewer, looked at this, and I think he agreed that it was in his words, very difficult to establish something, and there would be very large forward risk in doing something. But we did look at it multiple times, believe you me, and just couldn't quite find a way through.
So this wasn't a decision not to support a group. It was a decision very much that you would have looked at something if you couldn't find a way of doing it in a deliverable way that minimised unacceptable levels of fraud and so on.
Yeah.
And by the sound of it, you've come at this every which way, and there still isn't an obvious solution that presents itself.
No, I don't think that there is really.
No.
It's my reflection on it. Again, someone in the future might decide to do something different. But I mean, you clearly could. I mean, you could clearly just look at everyone who had dividend income in a tax return and send them an equivalent of a SAYS grant calibrated. You would do that with the 3/4 of grants by volume and more by pounds going to people who you were not really trying to help. So you could accept that, but I don't. To me, that would not seem like the right judgment to make.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now from the self-employed scheme into Kickstart. And just again, some context. Now, this was part of your plan for jobs announced by the Treasury on the 8th of July 2020, a £2 billion fund to create hundreds of thousands of high-quality 6-month work placements. It was aimed at 16 to 24-year-olds on universal credit, deemed to be at risk of long-term unemployment. Funding covered 100% of the national minimum wage for 25 hours a week, and the associated employer national insurance contributions and the employer minimum automatic enrolment contributions. And in terms of assessment, the evaluation found the majority of leavers at 7 and 10 months, that's 63 and 66%, who are in work, said that the skills and experience they gained have been important in helping them find work. And you've spoken already, Mr. Sunak, about your desire to support employment and jobs in the pandemic and putting that at the forefront. This is targeting young people in particular and trying to get them into work. Was there particular significance in trying to target that group of young people, 16 to 24?
Yes, that was something that weighed on me quite heavily. Throughout the pandemic was an understanding that young people were particularly at risk, and that's because they were 2.5 times more likely to work in the most affected sectors. And we also know that if young people have a bad interaction with the labour market early in their careers, if they're not able to find stable work when they're young, that has an impact on them for a long time to come. And it goes back to the scarring that we talked about right at the beginning. So, I was particularly worried about this cohort throughout. And, obviously different modules have looked at the impact on education and those outcomes. But, even for those young people who are just entering the labour market, those early years are really important in getting into good work habits, finding good, stable employment. That sets you up for life. And obviously what was happening with the pandemic was disrupting that. So, I had that in the back of my head, and Kickstart was as a way to target a job intervention program at that group and try and help them make sure that they have that experience of being in the labour market, being in work.
Yeah. And we understand from your statement that the Treasury was particularly involved in the design of Kickstart, and but also that you had a very keen personal interest in that scheme. Is that right?
Yes, I saw that. I'm not entirely sure what I had a personal interest in all of these things because I needed to make sure they all worked, and ultimately I was responsible and accountable for the overall economic response. But this as an idea actually came from the TUC, and probably, Francis and Kate won't love me keep referring to them, but I think we had a good, productive working relationship during this period, and it was something that they had called for. Others had called for it as well from memory, but I distinctly remember Frances O'Grady, as she was then, Baroness Grady now, and Kate talking about this. It was modelled on something called the Future Jobs Fund, which is a programme that had existed in 2008 from memory, and actually, I heard it and I thought that that sounds good, and we should be looking at something like that because of the concerns I had about the impact on young people, and I mentioned it to Therese Coffey at DWP, and as you've seen from her evidence, they took the idea and they led it, essentially. I mean, obviously we worked very closely together, and this is a good example of that policy partnership and the cells, and we were doing things really closely together, iterating together. But they obviously had primary responsibility for delivering this scheme, and we designed it together, and off they went and did it. And Mims Davis, who was the junior minister at the time, they took a lot of personal ownership of it, and it was a great collaboration. And I was always really, lots of the things that we did made a difference to people, and your stories video brings that to life. But I particularly, meeting young people who, because of this scheme, were in a job that they may not otherwise have had, and them being set up for life, I thought was a particularly good and positive outcome.
Now, the timing of the implementation of Kickstart, we understand it was stood up quite quickly, announced in July, and was going live in November of 2020. And was that because at the time it was announced, the expectation was that furlough would have ended on the 31st of October, and therefore there may be a spike in unemployment, and there may be a lot of young people who would need help getting into jobs? Yeah,
exactly as you said. It was designed in the context of the pandemic, and the restrictions are all winding down. The support schemes are winding down. We're going to focus now on jobs and creating new jobs and getting people into jobs. And this is an intervention that would be targeted particularly at young people.
Yeah. Of course, had you known what you came to find out in November, the timing suddenly looks different come November when we're going back into lockdown and you're extending furlough. And did you find that frustrating, really, that the scheme had been stood up very quickly? And you might know what it means, but it was described as a minimum viable product. In other words, it was stood up as, it could do what it said on the tin, but it wasn't particularly well worked or long worked up.
Of all the things that were frustrating to me during this period, I mean, that particular one probably was not that high on the list, but of course it was frustrating because it meant that this thing was not up and running in the way that we would have imagined when we announced it. That said, it's good that we've done the work, good that we got it up and running, and this point about minimum viable product, this really is proof of the test and learn iterative approach to policy making. And this is the thing. It's like we were saying, one person's targeting is another person's hard edge. That again, people like the sound of test and learn iterative policy making. Then what that means is what you put out there straight away is by definition not going to be perfect, most likely. But you're prioritizing getting it out there. That's what the minimum viable product is. We know it's going to basically work, and we'd rather just get it out there. Because then it can start to make a difference, and we can learn as we go and adjust it as we go, and do that in kind of reaction to what's happening in reality rather than in sitting in the meeting room. And this was a good example of that type of approach to policy making. Again, not optimally in the end able to be executed because kind of another lockdown got in the way, which was, as you said, frustrating.
But can I pick up that point about developing as you go? I mean, it was the indicative target was for 250,000 placements. Ultimately, there are 168,000 young people who had the benefit of a Kickstart place. One issue was whether the eligibility should be expanded beyond universal credit and so should include young people who are receiving JSA, for example, a legacy benefit, or expanded to include people who are in receipt of a PIP, personal independence payment, disabled people. If there wasn't the take-up, and if you were learning as you went, do you regret not expanding it to fill the places that were envisaged and expanding its reach?
I can't recall the kind of micro eligibility decisions and what the exact basis for each of those was. I think part of the reason that it didn't end up, I mean, still 150,000 young people benefited from this, and enormous credit to the team at DWP who did stand it up and deliver that, because I think it made a huge difference to those young people. It was because actually the economic recovery was stronger than we had anticipated it would be. I don't think that should necessarily be a sign of failure of the scheme. Actually, we didn't see the spike in youth unemployment that everyone had predicted when furlough ended. The economy, we know after all the revisions happened, 2 years later, recovered far faster during this period than initially it was given credit for. And unemployment stayed relatively low. And actually, so it's because we go back to this point before, the private sector, the regular market functioning of the economy was happening and jobs were being created. And so there was less need for the subsidised jobs through Kickstart in that sense. It was. I don't think you want to focus it on a group of people who really need it. That's what it was designed to do, and I think it did that effectively. And again, different people might have wanted to weight different things, but I can't recall the individual reasons for which bits of the universal credit system we were targeting. But I think it was particularly people who have been impacted by the pandemic or are at risk of being impacted by the pandemic. As we'll come on to later on in the UC discussion, some of these other benefits are not linked to the labour market or work requirements in quite the same way, or they're legacy benefits where people have been on for a longer period of time. Okay,
just so I understand, just to finish this area, and then we'll be about ready for the afternoon break. The Treasury had worked up the policy. You'd announced it in July as part of but the DWP was doing the delivery effectively.
No, but we worked on the policy together as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to imply they weren't involved in policy. Yes. But once you'd worked up the policy, they were responsible for delivery.
Yes. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I know. Again, I know the team at the Treasury were. There's probably some board that was set at how they do these things, and I would have wanted to keep an eye on things as well, same as I did when we get onto loans tomorrow or these interventions here. I would still keep an interest on them and do meetings to check in on progress, discuss with Therese Coffey, because we had to iterate. And we were iterating as we went. We changed the application process. It was the criteria at the beginning was quite tight on something called the additionality test. Getting technical, but we wanted to make sure that these jobs were jobs that ideally would not have existed without the support. So they were really doing something good with the taxpayer money. That test was probably too tight at the beginning, and Therese identified where we could broaden that out and just change the application process so it was quicker. And I worked through that with her, but her and her team did an exceptional job of getting this properly rolled out and getting these youngsters, a great job that could then hopefully, set them up for life, particularly in a difficult economic environment.
Okay. Thank you. My lady, that completes that topic, and I'm going to move on next to the uplifts to universal credit and working tax credit. So a minute or so early, but is that a convenient moment?
I'll forgive you a minute or so.
Thank you, my lady. That's very kind.
I should return at past.
All rise.
That's great.
Mr. Sunak, I'd like to turn in this final session for today to the subject of the uplift of £20 that was applied to universal credit and to working tax credit. This was announced on the 20th of March of 2020. implemented from the 6th of April 2020, and then there was an extension to the initial 12-month uplift that was formally agreed at a trilateral meeting on the 26th of February 2021, with the extension being announced on the 3rd of March 2021, and the uplift ending on the 6th of October 2021. So that's just to give some context. The idea, as a starting point, that there should be an uplift to those benefits, did that originate in the Treasury and with you?
I can't honestly recall. I would imagine the Treasury were talking already to DWP about various things. I think we'll come on to it later. The statutory sick pay, for example, those conversations were already happening. I remember them happening quite vividly on statutory sick pay, because there were also legislative aspects of that we needed to implement. So I can't say that it necessarily came from the Treasury versus DWP or some conversation between them.
I know you had a lot of things crossing your desk. I don't want it to be a memory test. Let me just put up INQ 000588230. This is the statement of Will Quince, who was the Minister in the DWP, paragraph 17. His recollection was that a commission came from you as Chancellor on around the 17th of March to the DWP to explore an increase. So it certainly seems to have been Treasury to DWP, according to Mr. Quince's recollection.
Yeah, well, I'll trust Will's recollection. I was fine. Yes. No, I was obviously doing a lot at that time and asking for lots of things in lots of different areas, but I didn't want to try and suggest that it was all from me, not knowing exactly where it came from.
No, and in fairness, that the evidence is slightly unclear about really who was driving the policy, and I'll just again, just out of fairness to you, Lady Coffey said effectively that the overall policy was being decided by her, but that you had to sign the cheque effectively. Mr. Quince recalled that the decisions were really made jointly by Lady Coffey and you as Chancellor, so that was how he saw it. I mean, it may not really matter, but do you have a clear recollection of who was making the decision?
I'm sure if the former Prime Minister was sitting here, he'd probably say it was actually the rest of us could decide what we like, but actually the decision left with him at the end of the day. I honestly can't remember. I think economic policy was generally driven out of the Treasury. I was driving it across the board at this moment in time. There are a few particular things about DWP policy, because the Secretary of State has a legal or has a statutory role in the setting of various benefit levels and has to undertake various reviews according to statute. So from a legal perspective, he or she has to be the one that formally makes the decision, potentially. So it might be some reflection of that, which I'm sure the teams can check. But I, as a general sense, I set out those criteria at the beginning of what we were trying to achieve. I, of course, in the context of all the different things we were doing, would have spoken to my team about, what do we do for those who are the most vulnerable, and what does some of those interventions look like? Of course, I would have said something like that, and that would have led to flurries of commissions and work, and then start going through options.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased you referenced that, because I was going to pick that up actually. That looking, as you put, the strong eye on the most vulnerable. This came at an early stage on any view, 17th of March. Yeah. So it appears that at an early stage, Treasury was certainly thinking about recipients of universal credit or working tax credit. I mean, but was there effectively a formal strategy in terms of how you were keeping that strong eye on the most vulnerable? or was it evolving in an iterative, organic way in the same way as all the other interventions were developing? But just you were keeping them in mind.
Well, I mean, you have to remember at this time, 20th of March. I mean, this is where every single day we were doing something, and something quite significant, and trying to tackle all the different aspects of economic policy. Loan guarantees over here, support for those universal credit. We'd already done a bunch of things in the budget for statutory sick pay changes, grants and business rate relief for hospitality businesses. So I think this is a period where you were trying to just hit everything because you knew that this was going to impact everyone pretty much in the country, and so I don't think there was, quite frankly, the time to really sit there and spend a day designing some overall big strategy plan that you could work to. It was just the knowledge that we had to move incredibly quickly in all these different areas, of which this was an important one, and that's why the work was being done on this probably exactly in parallel as the work on furlough, the work on C-bills, the work on grants. I mean, all those things were happening at exactly the same time.
And from your perspective, was this about alleviating economic hardship in general, or, as with all the other interventions we've discussed, was this about taking steps to minimise, alleviate economic hardship arising from the pandemic?
The latter, and that was none of these things are perfect, by the way, as we've discussed. But the general objective here was to support those who were the most financially disadvantaged or exposed as a direct result of the pandemic, especially those coming to universal credit for the first time potentially, and in doing that, wanting, as with previous discussions we've had and other interventions, provide that assistance very quickly. And here in particular, the conversations we've had previously about things that are simple, universal, that can be delivered at scale and understood, had a particular benefit because the reinsurance part in this area was particularly important.
And so, and I don't want to get into the background politics of the welfare state and so on and so forth, but from your perspective, and the reason I'm asking the questions is so we can look at the objective and how it was delivered, but from your perspective, this was about providing support arising from the pandemic, not to making changes generally in welfare provision in ordinary times.
Yeah, I think that, yes, in terms of the interventions that we were designing, yes, and by nature, as almost everything that we've spoken about was temporary, right? These were temporary, targeted interventions designed to deal with the particular issue that we faced. And
that's an important qualification you've just made from your perspective. When you signed off on the uplift, from your perspective, this was always temporary, by which I mean linked to the economic emergency presented by the pandemic.
Yes, and indeed that was the legal position as well. It was not a permanent uplift. The mechanism for delivering it was one that it lasted for 12 months.
Yeah. And so from your perspective, it was always going to end at some point. We'll discuss the
extension. Yeah.
But it was always going to end, and there shouldn't ever have been confusion about whether it was or wasn't going to end at some point because it was pandemic-related support.
Yes. And I think you can contrast it to something else we did, which I think we announced at the budget, which was also in the welfare system, and that was a permanent change, and that was a significant increase to local housing allowance, the LHA, which was, from memory, about a £1 billion increase to the welfare bill that benefited over 1.5 million people, and increasing the level of that benefit, that was a permanent. It happened to come in at the same time as these things. So obviously, as a marginal change, was particularly beneficial during this pandemic period. But there was no suggestion that was going to be unwound. We'd made that permanent change, and it started at the same time. Was incredibly helpful. It was announced at the budget. That change was designed to be permanent. So that, some welfare things we did were permanent. Others, like this, were deliberately temporary.
And so you're making the point there again, as you did with self-employed income support, it's necessary to look at all changes that were made, not just
Yes.
One thing at a time.
Yes,
right.
That's a very important point. And actually, you've jogged my memory, because one of the other interventions that was particularly helpful for self-employed was time to pay, which I should have mentioned in the previous session we had, which was announced at the budget, but this gave self-employed people and businesses more generally, but particularly valuable to self-employed people, an ability to delay their tax payments.
Yeah.
And that actually was taken up by lots of people. We extended it. We made it particularly much more easy to access, generous terms, and we know made a difference to people. And it's just another example of something else that was there, which particularly actually ended up helping those who are self-employed. But your broader point is absolutely right. There are so many different things going on at the same time.
I just want to focus initially about the objective of the uplift. And I preface these questions. It may seem at times that there's an element of semantics, but it is important to identify from your perspective what the objective was, because we've heard evidence from others about what they thought the objective was, and I just want to establish from your perspective why you were doing this. The way you put it in your statement, and I'll ask for it to be put up on the screen so we can see it. It's INQ 00661483, and it's page 267 of Mr. Sunak's statement, please, paragraph 1005. There we are. And you say the government's objective was to support those most financially exposed or disadvantaged as a direct result of the pandemic. It was determined that this was best achieved through the two benefits, which were both means-tested benefits and available where an individual suffered a reduction to their income as a result of reduced hours or unemployment, which created or further exacerbated low income. And the first point to note there is the point you've made in your evidence, that this was, so far as you were concerned, Mr. Sunak, to support those exposed to disadvantage as a direct result of the pandemic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, I suppose that can mean lots of different things, because you might be disadvantaged as a result of the pandemic, or financially exposed because the costs go up, for example. So you may not have lost any income, but you may find that it costs more to be at home because you've suddenly got to pay to heat your house all day, or you've got to educate your kids at home. But I don't get the impression that that's what you mean by financially exposed. Do you mean people who had lost income or employment and therefore were claiming universal credit? Or did you mean people who generally found themselves financially impacted?
Yeah, I mean, this was, as you described, and it says in the bottom of the highlighted bit, I mean, this is where people had an impact on their ability to work. And that would then either because their hours were reduced or reduced to zero, or made it less hard for them to get a job because of the various restrictions in place. And that's what this was geared to, which is what then led to the design of this particular policy. And we'll get into why we did it the way we did, and as this says, why we chose the particular basis for the uplift that we did, because it's, as we'll get into, linked to those employment outcomes and that work, and targeting people for whom earnings are a significant proportion of their overall income, and because it's that income that is facing the biggest change because of the pandemic and the fact that it was shutting down the economy, and therefore people couldn't work or couldn't find a job or had their hours reduced, and that was the bit that it was trying to get at. That said, a general increase in the standard allowance, does just have the obvious benefit of in general putting more money into the welfare system in a very broad-based way. It has a macroeconomic benefit of being a pretty effective fiscal stimulus in normal times, because the multiplier on that type of spending is typically very high. So there are other benefits or consequences of doing that have a more general application. But this is what we were trying to get at by doing it.
Right. So the objective was to support incomes of those who had either lost their job or seen a decline in income as a direct result of the pandemic. That's why it's focused on universal credit, which is a work-related
yes.
benefit. But if there were additional upsides, i.e. that generally speaking, all low-income households are supported by the additional money and therefore find it easier to cope with costs, or that there's an additional advantage of some element of fiscal stimulus because people have got more money to spend, then those are, they're not really trade-offs, they're sort of win-wins.
And it's not that we weren't aware of them,
no.
Right? Because those are all not bad things to have happen at this period either. And as I'm sure we'll hopefully have time to get into, when you look at the various measures of household income, disposable income, inequality, poverty, deprivation, etc., all those things in general either were constant or improved in many cases compared to the pre-pandemic year. So clearly this did have the benefit of more generally supporting lots of vulnerable people, which was something that we obviously knew going into it that it would do.
Yeah.
So it was nice that it was able to do both things.
And I don't want to jump ahead, but you've made a very valid point there about those figures, and we've heard about those statistics in the module. But I suppose again, it left you as Chancellor in a position where ultimately you'd have a hard political choice about not making it permanent. You were giving in these times of crisis, but from your perspective, you always knew you were going to have to take away again, which would have that negative effect on those households.
Yes, although at that point that the temporary support ended, but by definition we were trying to time that with the removal of all the things that had created the negative shock in the first place. So we were just back to a status quo ante in some sense. So shock comes, right, that we put support in to help people through the shock, and when you remove the shock, and obviously there's a ramp up which we went into previously, but in general, if we've gone back to a status quo ante world where that shock isn't there, we're not closing businesses down, people can work, everything's opening and recovering, then it's not unreasonable for, in a general sense, for policy to return back to where it was, not least because, as we discussed at the beginning and you just alluded to, all of these things have a fiscal cost. And, it was my job to make sure that we could manage that. And obviously that has an impact on future taxes, which I had to deal with. And that, I don't think anyone wants to, pay a great deal more tax. So in the back of your head, and there's a limit to how much we can borrow. So all of these things are reasonable things for people to think about as things return to normal.
And I don't want to get into the sort of raw politics of it and what lies behind the welfare system, but your position, as you said earlier, you're a fiscal conservative, and your view was we'll give the support while the pandemic was there. When it ends, it will be withdrawn because it's there to support during the pandemic, and we return to normal state.
That's very much my approach, and that is what we did, I think, across the suite of interventions, whether it's CJRS, SAYS, we'll get on to loans and grants tomorrow, but actually here, actually slightly kind of different to all the others, where there are no real legacies of the pandemic intervention. This is the one area where there actually is, in a sense, a permanent change, and that was because we're jumping ahead to the ending of this, but whilst the temporary uplift in universal credit ended, what I did at the end was permanently change the way the welfare and tax system interact by changing what's called the UC taper rate. And what that does is essentially reduce the rate at which your benefits are withdrawn as you earn more money. So effectively, it acts like a tax cut for those who are moving into more work from welfare. And that's something that lots of people had called for. I thought that was a sensible thing to do as a permanent change to our tax and welfare system. Obviously, it costs money. That was a decision I made. I think it cost £2 billion or something. And from memory at the time, it helped 2 million people. And that was, as said, unlike all the others in this area, there was a permanent change to the area of policy. It was not the same as a permanent uplift in universal credit, but it was a change to the universal credit system, but done in a way that particularly increased the incentive and therefore the reward for people who were moving into employment from welfare and making sure that they could keep more of the money that they were earning, which I thought was a good, sensible thing to do.
And again, not getting into the sort of the politics of this, but this aligns with what you said earlier about believing in supporting people through jobs and work and employment and providing support in that way.
Yes, and particularly as the economy was open and growing, and my general view is, and actually the Prime Minister's view, at the end of the day, it was also the Prime Minister's view that, and I believe it, the Prime Minister at the time believed it, I believe it now, actually supporting people into work and giving people the security and dignity of a good job, and then allowing them to keep far more of their hard-earned money rather than the state taking it in taxes is in general a good thing. And the kind of effective tax rate for people who are moving off universal credit into work was quite high. I think it was 60% or higher. Think about that as a marginal tax rate, and it is quite high. And what I was able to do at the end is reduce that somewhat, quite meaningfully, which again supports an objective of helping people into work, which is long-term the best route to financial security for them, and help them help them keep more of their money, move into work, provide financial security and resilience for them and their families, and also hopefully have an impact on reducing poverty levels as well.
Well, I think we've dealt with, from your perspective, the policy objective seems to have been clear. Temporary measure aimed at the pandemic will be withdrawn at the end, and then you've talked about the other changes you made. Can I pick up then, against that background, with the fact that the uplift, or a decision was made that the uplift would not apply to legacy benefit claimants. So it would only apply to working tax credits or universal credit. And can you help us, from your perspective, why that decision was made? Was it made for operational reasons? We've heard a lot about the old IT system, and it took 5 months, I think it was said, to plumb in every year any changes in the levels of benefit, and the whole thing would fall over. Or was it taken not to apply it to legacy benefits because that would be inconsistent with the overall objective, as you've identified it, of the uplift, i.e. to compensate those who were newly unemployed or seen a reduction because of the pandemic?
I think first and foremost, it just simply wasn't possible operationally. I think as a again, I can't remember the exact conversations at the time, and we should get into it. Also would not have as cleanly supported the policy objective, but in a sense, we can have that academic discussion and go through why, but it just simply operationally was not doable. And I think you've got evidence from the officials at DWP and the bits that stood out to me, which I remember. I mean, the whole point about universal credit was it's this new system. The old system is very creaky, very old, and it's simply not possible. As one of them said, I forget whether it was a DG at DWP or the director of Universal Credit.
I think it was Neil Cooling.
You had two different ones, but I think one of them said it's just simply not possible to digitally uprate mid-year. But I think the bit that stood with me from Neil is where he said the risk of system failure was too great to go ahead with a change. That was advice at the time, and there was a risk that benefits just stopped altogether. So that's from the people. Again, I'm not the one on the front line of grappling with these things, and I haven't worked in that department. But the very strong opinion of all the people who have to do this and make sure everyone on those systems gets the support that they're entitled to, we're all saying that this simply isn't possible, and you risk trying to do anything here and the whole thing might just collapse entirely. So first and foremost, I just think that they were so unequivocal about that we should get into the policy discussion in a second. I'm very happy to have that, but I think I just would be there was no ambiguity. It wasn't if you're happy to take some risk, maybe it's fine, and it's a risk judgment. It was pretty binary. It was, you cannot do this, it won't work, we can't do it. If you try and make it happen, the thing will most likely just completely collapse. That was very much my recollection of it at the time, and rereading the evidence from everyone and the advice. I think that kind of aligns with my memory of it.
So this goes further than, for example, the discussion we were having earlier about HMRC and the pressures they were under. That was operational pressure, but this was actually a stark warning that the whole thing would fall over.
Yes, that's actually a helpful distinction. There were things, as we were saying with Jim, like he could do a workaround, he could do a manual thing, and he'd say, fine, well, it will delay all these other things, or it will mean we can do it, it will take 2 months. There was none of those things, I don't think, that we've discussed where the whole thing will collapse, or it's just simply not possible. This was in that category. And I think that was a consistent view from the ministers who were there, with Will Quince and Therese Coffey. I think agree with that view. Obviously, they were best placed, not me, to diligence that view, but that was very much the consistent view across DWP amongst the officials and the ministers.
And what about
a helpful distinction that you've made between some of the HMRC operational things, which are, as I said, as you highlighted rightly, are different.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to talk across you.
No, sorry.
And so far as the policy debate, if you like, about whether providing the uplift to claimants of legacy benefits was consistent with the policy, where did you stand on that?
Yeah, I think, as I said, it's important that this is a theoretical debate, because it, in any case, was not doable. But I think from a policy perspective, there's a number of reasons why targeting these legacy benefits was not in keeping with the main policy objective. I mean, first and foremost was that the majority of the claimants, for example, on employment and support allowance, were not required to carry out work, or they didn't have work requirements built into their eligibility. So, by definition, the income, you might suffer a drop in income or not be able to do income. It was irrelevant to your benefit eligibility and what you would receive. And I think child tax credits, by definition, were not working enough to qualify for working tax credits again. So that would be in that category. I think your expert, Dr. Brewer, talked about some of the other legacy benefits in there. I think maybe carer's allowance and PIP, but please bear with me, because my memory of each precise benefit at the time might not be precise. But I think he also said many of those legacy benefits were not, were not designed to provide income protection when people lost hours or work. That they were there regardless of that, which is why they didn't meet the policy objective. And that, I think, is first and foremost the reason. I think secondly, because by definition they were legacy benefits and they were quite old, anyone who was new to the welfare system and therefore directly impacted by the pandemic in that sense would be on the universal credit system. They wouldn't be going on to these legacy benefits, right? The people on these systems would have been there for a while, and whereas anyone newly affected by the pandemic would go on to universal credit. They wouldn't come to these benefits, so you wouldn't be capturing anyone directly newly affected who's moved on to welfare. And then probably the last couple of things are, it was always possible for people, if they wanted to move on to universal credit if they so chose. Now, people will say, well, they might be worse off, and for some people that might have been true, for sure. But I think the numbers at the time were for the vast majority, maybe as much as 70%, I think, as someone has put in the evidence, it would have been actually financially better off had they made the move. Now, that was never an explicit policy objective of any of this, but it was just something to know that for at least 70% of people on legacy benefits would be better off going on to UC anyway. So that was available for them. And maybe, I mean, lastly, I think in the budget, again, not that this was particularly relevant, but for this conversation, but just context, legacy benefits had been frozen from memory for 4 or 5 years, and the spring budget, that budget that I did in 2020, I think we uprated them in line with inflation and removed the benefits free. So they were actually getting an uplift for the first time in some time, as compared to the last few years as well. So those are a range of reasons why it didn't, fully align with the policy objective, or there was a mitigation that was in place that may have helped.
Okay. Well, thank you for that full answer. But so it comes back to this: you couldn't do it anyway, even if you'd have wanted to. But if you had been able to operationally, those are all reasons why it didn't align with the policy objective. Thinking about the most vulnerable, economically and otherwise vulnerable, do you accept the counterpoint that, particularly those in receipt of disability benefits, PIP payments and others, that by not applying the uplift to legacy benefits, they were disproportionately going to be impacted, disabled people in particular?
Well, I think there was some gateway that had prevented previously disability claimants from transitioning onto UC. That was removed at some point, so that again for those group of legacy benefits would enable them to move on to UC, and then so more broadly it goes back to what we're trying to achieve, because those benefits hadn't changed, and for those people who were not working and would not have seen a change to their incomes as a result, because my memory of what the benefits that they received was designed to do was to support them with living costs. So it's a totally different benefit, and so that's why the policy objectives are slightly different. And obviously there was a regular increase in those benefits, as I said, because the uplift happened that budget and then came into force in April as it was.
I turn this argument on its head and look at it the other way in terms of applying the uplift to universal credit, to all universal credit claimants. Looking at the other way, with public money in mind, did it mean that some people were getting an uplift that they were not intended to receive, if it was intended to be applied to those who were new claimants and or had seen a drop in income? In other words, those who've been claiming universal credit for some time.
But by obviously by definition, I mean, yes, because same as we've discussed in all of these things, that's the downside in universality.
Was there a way of avoiding that, though, and targeting, therefore, only new claimants? And the reason I ask is, if the objective is to support people who've lost their income because they've lost their job and therefore they're having to have recourse to benefit, if you could have only helped those people, you might have been able to help them proportionately more.
But you have to remember it's not as simple as that, because as well as brand new people coming onto the system, there's also people who are already on the system whose hours are reduced as a result of the pandemic that would still fall into that same category. And then you would have to capture those people, as you rightly should, and then you're into a question of, well, whose hours are being reduced because of the pandemic, whose hours are reduced because they're doing something themselves or whatever it is. So you quite quickly end up in, I think, probably not an easy place to start differentiating between all these people. And my understanding, again, is that, and it's in the evidence, and I think you heard this from Will, it goes back to the operational complexity. Again, we sit here now and it was all fine. universal credit saw something like a 3 million increase in claims. I mean, a more than doubling of claims to universal credit in a matter of weeks. Let's be clear, if that had happened before universal credit, the system would have fallen down. Right, so all the people, as before, and I can't take any credit for that, all the people who preceded me, who designed that system, implemented that system, probably with lots of people telling them it was a waste of time or they were doing something wrong, they all deserve an enormous amount of praise. Because had we not had the brand new universal credit system and had it embedded for the years that we had before the pandemic came along, it would have been awful for millions of incredibly vulnerable people. The old system would have just not coped at all with that volume of new claimants coming to it. So we were also conscious of that. We needed to make sure that whatever we did was operationally going to be deliverable and not collapse, particularly because we're dealing with really vulnerable people who need this support in a timely fashion. And that's what also pushed us towards the simplicity of a flat rate change to the standard allowance without any micro-targeting beyond that, because there's multiple different versions of what you've just said, Mr. Wright. You could vary the amounts for different groups of people. You could target these people over here who are new, but not everyone before. And there's all sorts of targeting you could have done. And I think again, from the official, he said, this avoided obviously the complications, and the director of UC has put in evidence that they simply don't believe the department could have implemented a more targeted approach in the desired time frame. And I think Will Quince in his evidence specifically says it just that talk of targeting fails to appreciate the pace of events and the complexity of the systems and the high risk of inequity that this could create. So is a flat rate universal standard allowance increase perfectly targeted? Of course it isn't, but for delivering what we needed it to do, being able to be done without collapsing the system and to be able to be communicated very simply with that universality to provide a broader reassurance to a very vulnerable group of people and provide those broader benefits that we talked about. I thought it was a sensible and right policy to pursue.
So we're seeing the same sort of problems across all of the three big, simple interventions, if you like, job retention scheme, self-employed scheme, uplift, which is that targeting sounds great, but when you start to try and do it, you either have hard edges, cliff edges that leave lots of people shouting, what about me? Or it becomes operationally impossible.
Yes, or then undermines the benefit you get from a simple message that everyone can understand and take some confidence and reassurance from. And look, I would say, just because people shout at you and get upset at you is not a reason not to do it, right? Like we're in the business of, at least I certainly, you try and be in the business of trying to do the right thing for the country. It's not always easy, and people do get upset with you, and you'd like them to, generally come along with you on the journey, but sometimes they don't. But that's life, and I did that on the self-employment scheme and did get all that criticism, but I just thought it was the right thing to do and was happy to justify it. And similarly, when I had that budget in spring 21 and raised taxes to start paying back this money again, I did it because it was the right thing to do, and of course people were upset about that. So just that in and of itself is not a great reason. But let's be honest, we're talking about politics and people are responsive to public opinion, so we should be conscious about that. And recommendations and other things have to be, I think, realistic about what is possible and what is not. And it also goes to what you were saying before. It is not as easy to withdraw these things. It's all very well putting them in place. When you say, okay, that temporary thing is finished and now we're not going to do this anymore, or now we have to start paying it back, it's not as if everyone says, oh, you know what, you did tell us that and it's all fine. Of course they don't, right? And you wish it was so. But that said, like on this particular thing, I actually think there wasn't an appropriate targeting that could have been done. It wasn't that people would have been upset with you or not. I just didn't think it was the right thing to do for what this intervention was, or it would have risked an enormous amount of complexity, which would have then undermined the policy objective.
I'm going to come on now to look at the extension.
Yes,
because
just before that, Mr. Wright, I just want to finish off on legacy, because obviously we're forward looking as well. I know obviously Milady and you want to think about forward. On this debate on the legacy, in any case, is one where it is firmly in the rearview mirror, because the transition, I think, will be completed by next spring from memory. So, this is one where, look, I did what I did, and together with the other ministers will take responsibility and accountability for that. It wasn't possible in any case. So I don't think there's, it said there's an academic discussion, but this thankfully won't be relevant in the future if it ever comes up again, because everyone will be on the universal credit system.
Yeah, with its enhanced IT capability.
With it, and we now know it can cope with something that is, as I said, I'm glad I remember that, because I really would say all the people who did that deserve a lot of thanks, because it was, I think it went from 2.5 million claimants to 5.7, 5.8 in a matter of weeks. I've never, no one ever. This is going back to our previous thing. We've got 3 million people claiming for SAYS. We've got 1 million businesses, 10 million people at HMRC. We've got an extra, 3+ million people accessing the universal credit system. These are huge numbers that we're talking about, and happening in days and weeks.
Did that also feed into your assessment as to whether to provide a flat rate or to change the rate depending on the composition of households? Because that was certainly discussed.
And the decision, and again, I think would do the same again, was the flat rate, for all the reasons that we've just discussed, did exactly what we needed it to do.
Simple, easy to communicate, and easy to stand up.
And deliverable.
Right.
Yeah.
So when it came to the extension of the uplift, I mean, these benefits were uprated for a year until 2021. That's the end point unless something is done. It's not a question of withdrawing it. It's been a 1 year uprating.
Yes.
But there became a discussion about the extension, and the discussion presumably became necessary because of the health position in the nation and restrictions continuing and so on and so forth. There was some disagreement, wasn't there, between DWP and Treasury as to how, A, whether there should be an extension, B, if there was an extension, how it should be configured. The Secretary of State for DWP was arguing for splitting it, reducing the one part to £10, then £10 for a child. Or also you were exploring the possibility of a one-off lump sum payment as an alternative. So can you just, from your perspective, explain to us where you sat with, first of all, whether there should be an extension initially, and then how that should be delivered, whether a lump sum or retaining a flat rate?
Yes. So I think probably, I think this is actually a good example of cabinet decision making working quite well. I think actually there was completely good-natured, constructive discussions between Tiz, me, and the then Prime Minister about this issue. Lots of good meetings, lots of going through the options. To your point earlier, everyone working from the same set of shared facts, figures, analysis from DWP and HMT about the options. I think the thinking evolved. We started discussing this probably in the autumn, and obviously the health situation then was changing between then and when we ended up making the final decisions going into the spring budget. So I think my thinking may well have evolved during that period, and I think where we ended up was what I think was again, why did we do it? It aligned with the other things that we were doing. We're going to go through all the different interventions. They broadly align, or the economic interventions, if you look at how they were all phased out, they all broadly align with the health restrictions phasing out. If you put a chart on, we had it in one of the bits of evidence. We thought about it across the piece. The loan schemes, the grants, SAYS, or the last SAYS grant, CGRS, universal credit. It wasn't as if one thing was ending here, one thing was ending there, one thing was ending there. They were all actually, if you look at them, being done in a pretty consistent and coherent manner. And again, all of that was driven by the changing health picture. So this ending at the end of September at the same time that SAYS ended, that CGRS ended, that the grants ended, again, you'll see a kind of similarity amongst all of these things. So that's kind of where we settled on. I think it's not unfair that there's a bit of disagreement about that. The Secretary of State for Work and Pensions arguing for more money for the welfare system. It was ever thus, and I'm sure it will always be ever thus in general.
Can I pick that point up? I mean, Mr. Quince was quite candid in his evidence about this, in that he took the view, well, we've got the money in the system now, let's try and make it permanent, really. Let's try and land it permanently. Now, this is, would you say, you going back to your ordinary state as Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is a responsibility to overall government spending and budgets, and was this the point at which you've been looking at this as an economic intervention related to the pandemic? That's how it had come in. That's still how you were looking at it. But the DWP was moving on to thinking about it in terms of, can we bank this going forwards?
I think Will, if you asked him, would probably not disagree with your characterisation of it. And I think if you look at his evidence, I think he said, I can't say I disagree with the final decision made by the Chancellor, competing fiscal priorities, complex trade-offs. Totally reasonable for him to make the case. And at the end of the day, the Secretary of State, myself, the PM, we sat through, actually very constructively went through the options, settled on the extension. The one-off payment was for working tax credits because it could only operationally be done that way, the way that system worked. It was either a one-off payment or 12 months from memory. There's a debate amongst the people that spend time on this about one-off, whether large lump sum payments are necessarily great or not great for people.
Just jumping in there, I think the Treasury was really saying to the DWP, you were pointing out to them there's actually some evidence the other way that people cope perfectly well with lump sum payments.
I think there's a reasonable debate about that amongst people. In the end, I'm not sure it was ever whether it was possible or not for universal credit. I don't know. It might have been, but it was also we did do the 6 months. I think that's fine. Working tax credits, it had to be done in that way because the system is not able to do 6 months worth of payments. So we did it that way for working tax credits. It was an operationally driven decision rather than a policy decision. And if we did have the choice in universal credit, which I can't remember, we clearly decided to do it 6 months. And so that was, that's where we settled. As I said, I think it was entirely reasonable given everything else we were doing. And then, as we discussed earlier, what happened at the end of that was a permanent change to the universal credit system, which made it more generous as people moved into employment and worked, and essentially reduced the tax rate on them for working more.
Can I just pick up the point about lump sum payments in the context of legacy benefits? Accepting what you've said about, for operational reasons, you just couldn't deliver the uplift to legacy benefits. We now moved on quite a long time in the pandemic, by the time of the extension. Had other work been done to see whether it would be, or an uplift to legacy benefits would be deliverable, payable by lump sum, if the policy objective had shifted, so that you could do something about that?
I can't recall. I remember early in the pandemic, it was certainly the case, and I think you've had evidence on this point, that it simply wasn't possible to do one-off payments for legacy benefits. I think the quote in the evidence is, that they'd never tested the emergency payments system at that scale, and that they would need at least 6 months to go through all of that. And I don't recall, when that work started. Given all the other demands on DWP's time, I'm not sure where that was. Thankfully, it was in place by the time of spring 2022, when we were responding to the energy bill shock, and we were able to use that new emergency payment system that had at that point been improved, or whatever it was that needed to happen to it, so we could use it to deliver effective lump sum payments. So again, in terms of the future, that has now been done, but I think legacy payments in the future won't be an issue. So it's
Because everyone will be on universal
credit anyway. So, but in any case, it had been done by spring 2022, which was good because we used it to respond to the energy shock.
I'm sorry to get into what you might consider to be the weeds of details at 4:20, but just on when the decision to uplift was actually made, I just wonder if you can help us with this. And I'll give, there seem to be a few meetings, key meetings, in February of 2021. There was one on the 4th of February where the Secretary of State, Prime Minister and yourself had a trilateral. You had a bilateral meeting with the Prime Minister on the 8th of February where we know that universal credit was discussed. And you say in your statement you agreed to proceed on the 17th of February, 2021. And then there's a further trilateral meeting on the 26th of February. Can you help us at all with, your statement says 17th of February you agreed to proceed. Was it likely at the bilateral with the Prime Minister on the 8th of February, do you think, or was it a sort of continuing dialogue?
I honestly can't remember, but the budget was on the 3rd of March, and it was announced at the budget, and this is something that everyone is a bit more intimately familiar with OBR processes now, but that was something, it's the kind of thing that you would need to have communicated to the OBR, some period of time before the 3rd of March, maybe. And I tended not to do things last minute, so that I would have imagined would have been towards the end of Feb, maybe the 20th or something. So that feels about right to me, but I can't honestly remember beyond what I put in my statement as to where it was. But look, the Prime Minister was intimately involved in all of this, and would have signed off on the final decisions, as he would because of all the budget decisions. He would go through with me and sign off on them, and this was something that he'd had the meetings with Therese and me on, and ultimately took the final decision.
In terms of then the uplift ending, and again, it wasn't that a decision was taken to end it, it was just that it had been extended and so it then came to its end, and that's probably the right way of looking at it.
Yes.
It's not a new decision not to end it. But looking back, and you having been very clear about what your objectives were and why you were doing this, and accepting that the DWP, in terms of extension, were pushing to try and land it permanently, do you think that public communication could have been clearer, should have been clearer, that from the very outset, don't get used to this, putting it bluntly, this is a temporary measure, that's all it's ever going to be?
I can't recall each individual instance that I was asked. I can't imagine that I was ambiguous on that point. And again, it's the same as all of the interventions. We'll go over the others tomorrow, but all the ones we've been through today all had and most of it was all announced at the spring budget, in that 3rd of March, where there was roadmaps for CJRS, for SAYS, business grants, etc., universal credit, working tax credit, all of that was announced. Here's the plan, here's the exit roadmap from the pandemic, here's how the economic support is going to taper off over the next 6 months. Look, there's always people who would want to create and lobby and create news and talk to people to try and get energy around the idea it should be extended. Of course, that's going to happen. But I guess the person who's doing that job, whether it was me then or someone in the future, they can't stop people from agitating or lobbying for it to be made permanent and suggesting there are reasons it should be. That's always going to happen. And I would have been consistent, I would imagine, throughout that, we've set out a set of taperings or finality to these schemes, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah. We understand that the DWP itself didn't do any monitoring or evaluation of the uplift in terms of that very narrow intended target group. I accept the wider point you've made about if you like, the unintended benefits to everybody who received it in terms of poverty and living standards and so on. But in terms of its actual economic objective of cushioning the blow of those who lost their jobs or lost income, are you aware that whether the Treasury did any evaluation or not? And if not, isn't that important if you're spending money in that way to evaluate it?
Yes. I mean, we do know a range of things, and I think it's worth, just in the time we have, because this was something that, as I said at the beginning, was an objective of mine to support the most vulnerable, and I'm proud of what the government did and everyone who worked on this achieved. And like everything, nothing's perfect. But I think you've had evidence from lots of people, including the expert witnesses, who have been clear that what we did made a considerable difference to those low-income households. So much so that, according to Dr. Brewer, deprivation and poverty didn't actually seem to increase during this period, which is surprising given the economic turmoil, and actually the official data shows that the proportion of households living in relative poverty actually fell from 22% to 20% during this period of time. The number of children in poverty fell, according to the Child Poverty Action Group, and some of the academic research that has been done by Blundell and others showed that income inequality fell during the pandemic. And then DWP do a survey, the HBAI survey, the Households Below Average Income Survey, and we have some data from that which shows that the proportion of people facing food insecurity was lower in this pandemic year than it was the year before. Disposable incomes of the poorest fifth were higher, and actually material deprivation, because you've talked about costs previously as well, were lower. So even if there wasn't a formal DWP evaluation done, which obviously question for them, and maybe it can be done. There's an enormous amount of official data, academic research, survey data, and the Treasury published distribution analysis at all the events showing all these things that I've described, demonstrating that in aggregate, the policy objective supporting the most vulnerable people in society, by and large, did a good job of delivering on that, and all the data that I've just been through would demonstrate that. And again, of course, it's not perfect, and that's why we have the hardship fund, which would pick up anyone who was really in need. The local housing authority uplift we talked about, and others, but by and large, these interventions targeted at this group of people worked and averted what the Resolution Foundation said could have been a living standards disaster, and actually helped cushion that considerably and protect people. So I think I'm grateful to all the teams who worked on it, because I thought they did an excellent job.
Mr. Sunak, I can't promise I've finished questions on working tax credit, so I'm going to ask you to keep your finger in the page, as it were, overnight, just because we've covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time, and I want to go back over my notes overnight just to check there's nothing else I want to ask you about. But, my lady, I wonder if that's a convenient moment for now.
It is. It's been a long day, both for Mr. Sunak and I'm sure for you, Mr. Wright. I'm sorry we've got to ask you to come back tomorrow, Mr. Sunak, but the team are very conscious that you have to get away by lunchtime, and I promise you that you will be leaving here before we break for lunch tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
So I shall return for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
All rise.